The most terrifying moment for a narcissist is not when you leave. It is when you stay completely calm. When they realize their words no longer hurt you, their attention no longer controls you, and their presence no longer defines your worth, something inside their world begins to collapse. Because the moment you stop caring is the moment they lose the power they once had over your emotions. And what happens next reveals the hidden psychology behind control, validation, and the human need to be seen. Have you ever noticed how someone's behavior changes when they realize they can no longer push your buttons? One day, they seem confident and untouchable. The next day, they are searching for a reaction, trying to understand why their old methods no longer work. This is not simply about ignoring someone. It is about a deeper psychological transformation. It is the moment when a person stops abandoning themselves to keep someone else comfortable. When you no longer chase explanations, defend your choices, or desperately seek their approval, the entire emotional structure changes. The person who once controlled the rhythm of your emotions suddenly discovers that they no longer hold the same position in your mind. Stay with me, because we are going to explore what happens inside the mind of someone who depended on your reaction, and why your indifference can become the strongest message you ever send. If you have ever experienced a relationship where someone's behavior made you question your own worth, take a moment to reflect on this. The most powerful shift happens when a narcissistic person realizes that they no longer have the ability to control your emotional world. For a long time, their influence may have depended on your reactions, your anger, your sadness, your need to explain yourself, your desire to be understood. All of these responses became a source of psychological energy. But when you stop reacting in the same way, the entire dynamic begins to change. A person who relies on control often does not fear losing an argument. They fear losing significance. They want to feel that they can still enter your mind, disturb your peace, and shape your emotions. When you reach a place where their words no longer create the same pain and their actions no longer determine your self-worth, they encounter a reality they cannot easily accept. This moment can feel confusing because they may wonder why the strategies that once worked suddenly fail. The criticism that once made you defend yourself no longer receives an emotional response. The distance that once made you chase them no longer creates panic. The approval you once searched for from them is replaced by acceptance within yourself. From a deeper psychological perspective, this is the moment when you begin reclaiming the parts of yourself that were given away in the search for validation. You stop living as a reflection of someone else's expectations and begin returning to your own inner foundation. The loss of control can create discomfort for the narcissistic individual because they are forced to confront the absence of the power they believed they possessed. They may attempt to provoke reactions, create emotional confusion, or remind you of the connection you once shared. But the greatest change is not in their behavior. It is in your perception. When you no longer need them to recognize your value, their ability to influence you begins to disappear, and your freedom becomes something they can no longer take away. Silence has a unique psychological power because it removes the emotional reflection that another person may have depended on. When a narcissistic individual realizes that their words, actions, or attempts to provoke you no longer create the reaction they expected, they are confronted with something deeply uncomfortable, a mirror that no longer reflects the image they wanted to see. For a long time, they may have measured their influence by your responses. If you became upset, they knew they had reached you. If you defended yourself, they knew they had entered your emotional space. If you continued explaining your feelings, they knew you were still searching for their understanding. But when you become calm and silent, the familiar pattern disappears. This silence is not about punishment or revenge. It is not about becoming cruel or trying to hurt someone back. It is about emotional detachment. It represents a person who has stopped fighting for recognition from someone who refuses to truly see them. Your silence becomes a reflection of your inner transformation because you are no longer allowing another person's behavior to decide your emotional state. The absence of your reaction can reveal things that were previously hidden. Without your emotions to focus on, the narcissistic person may be forced to face their own insecurities, fears, and unresolved feelings. The energy they once directed toward controlling the relationship has nowhere to go, and this can create confusion or frustration. But the deeper lesson is not about what happens to them. It is about what happens within you. When you stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you begin listening to your own inner voice. You discover that peace does not come from finally making someone understand your pain. It comes from no longer needing their permission to heal. The strongest message you can send is not an argument, a confrontation, or a final explanation. It is the quiet realization that your soul no longer depends on their attention, and their ability to disturb your peace has faded completely. When a narcissistic person realizes that their usual methods no longer affect you, one of the most common responses can be an attempt to regain influence. The sudden change may appear surprising because someone who once seemed distant, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable may suddenly become warm, caring, and interested again. They may bring back memories, offer apologies, promise change, or remind you of the connection you once had. But the deeper psychological pattern is not always about genuine transformation. Sometimes it is about restoring a familiar emotional balance where they once felt powerful and secure. When someone loses the ability to trigger your emotions, they may experience a sense of uncertainty because the role they played in your life has changed. The attention they once received is no longer guaranteed, and this can feel like a threat to their sense of importance. This is why some people return not because they have truly understood the damage they caused, but because they miss the emotional access they once had. They may miss being able to influence your thoughts, receive your reassurance, or feel that they occupy a central place in your world. The important shift happens when you learn to observe actions rather than being controlled by words. Real change is not shown through temporary affection or dramatic promises. It is revealed through consistency, accountability, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Your growth becomes visible when you no longer respond from old wounds. Instead of immediately believing every apology or chasing every moment of attention, you become aware of the pattern beneath the behavior. You begin asking a deeper question. Is this person truly changing, or are they trying to restore the old dynamic? The moment you stop being controlled by emotional highs and lows is the moment you regain your inner strength. You no longer become lost in someone else's attempts to pull you back into a cycle. You stand firmly in your own awareness, understanding that your peace is more valuable than temporary attention, and your freedom is worth protecting. Not caring anymore is often misunderstood as becoming cold, heartless, or disconnected. But true emotional detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of inner balance. It is the moment when you stop allowing another person's behavior to determine your sense of peace, identity, and worth. This shift represents a powerful psychological transformation because you are no longer living from a place of fear, approval-seeking, or emotional dependence. For a long time, a person involved with a narcissistic individual may find themselves constantly analyzing, questioning, and trying to fix the relationship. They may wonder what they did wrong, how they can be understood, or what they need to change to receive love and respect. Slowly, their attention moves away from themselves and becomes focused entirely on the other person's moods, reactions, and expectations. But healing begins when that energy returns home. You begin to recognize that your value was never created by someone else's acceptance of you. You understand that love should not require you to abandon your own emotional needs or sacrifice your inner peace just to maintain a connection. This is the moment when your psychological foundation becomes stronger. You stop chasing validation and start trusting your own perception. You no longer need constant reassurance that you are enough because you have developed a deeper relationship with yourself. A narcissistic person may notice this change because the emotional pattern they relied upon no longer exists. The arguments, the explanations, and the desperate attempts to be understood disappear. What remains is a person who is centered, aware, and no longer controlled by external approval. The greatest transformation is not that you stop caring about another person. It is that you finally begin caring about yourself in a way you were unable to before. Your compassion remains, but your boundaries become stronger. Your heart remains open, but your self-respect becomes unshakable. When you reach this state, someone else's inability to value you no longer becomes a reason to question your own worth, because you have discovered the strength that was always within you. When a narcissistic person experiences the feeling of losing your attention, approval, or emotional reaction, it can create what many psychologists describe as an ego wound. This does not simply mean feeling disappointed. It represents a deeper disturbance in the image they have created about themselves and their importance in someone else's life. Many narcissistic patterns are built around maintaining a certain perception. They may need to feel admired, powerful, desired, or in control because these external reflections help support their internal sense of identity. When someone stops responding to them in the expected way, it challenges the belief that they can influence and define the emotional world around them. The surprising part is that the greatest impact is often not caused by confrontation. It is caused by your calmness. When you stop arguing, stop proving yourself, and stop seeking their approval, you remove the emotional fuel that once kept the cycle alive. Your peace becomes a statement that says, "My value does not depend on your recognition." This can create confusion because the narcissistic person may have become accustomed to seeing themselves as someone who could easily affect your emotions. They may struggle to understand why the same words that once created fear, guilt, or doubt no longer have the same power. The change they are witnessing is not just a change in your behavior. It is a change in your entire inner foundation. However, the purpose of your growth is not to create a wound in someone else. It is not about making another person suffer or proving that you have won. The deeper purpose is reclaiming your own psychological freedom. When you no longer need someone else's validation to feel complete, you step into a healthier relationship with yourself. The greatest shift occurs when you realize that your peace is not something another person can give or take away. Their approval becomes less important, their criticism loses its weight, and their attempts to define you become powerless. The moment you stop seeking permission to be yourself is the moment you become emotionally free, and no external reaction can take that freedom away. One of the most revealing moments in a toxic dynamic is when a narcissistic person realizes that the emotional tools they once used no longer create the same effect. When control begins to disappear, they may attempt to awaken the old emotions that once kept you connected. They may bring up painful memories, remind you of the good moments, create feelings of guilt, or say things designed to make you question your decision to step back. This happens because emotional reactions often create a sense of connection and influence. Anger, sadness, confusion, and the need to explain yourself can all keep a person psychologically attached. When you are constantly trying to defend your feelings or prove your intentions, your attention remains focused on them. But when you become aware of the pattern, you begin to see the difference between a genuine connection and an emotional cycle. The deeper psychological transformation occurs when you stop responding from old wounds. You no longer allow someone's words to immediately create fear, guilt, or self-doubt. Instead, you observe what is happening with greater awareness. You begin asking yourself whether the interaction is leading toward healing or simply pulling you back into a familiar pattern. A narcissistic person may attempt to recreate the past because the past represents a time when they had greater emotional access to you. They may try to remind you of who you were before you discovered your own strength, but the person you have become is no longer searching for the same answers. You are no longer trying to convince someone to see your value because you have started seeing it yourself. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming conscious. You can still care, but you no longer allow care to become a doorway for manipulation. You can remember the good moments without ignoring the painful ones. You can forgive without returning to the same cycle. The greatest power comes when you recognize that your emotions belong to you. No one else has the authority to control your peace unless you surrender that power. When you choose awareness over reaction, you break the invisible chains that once kept you trapped, and you begin walking forward with a strength that no manipulation can take away. The moment you stop seeking approval from a narcissistic person, the entire relationship dynamic begins to transform. For a long time, the connection may have been built around an imbalance where one person's emotions, opinions, and reactions carried more weight than the others. You may have found yourself constantly adjusting, explaining, apologizing, or trying to prove that your intentions were good enough. But when you begin choosing self-respect over approval, the foundation of that relationship starts to shift. A narcissistic dynamic often survives through emotional imbalance. One person becomes focused on gaining recognition, while the other becomes focused on receiving it. This creates a cycle where your sense of peace depends on whether the other person is pleased, accepting, or satisfied. But when you awaken to your own inner strength, you begin to realize that your worth was never something another person had the power to give you. This change can be unsettling for someone who was comfortable with the old pattern. They may notice that you no longer react the same way, that you no longer rush to defend yourself, and that you no longer allow their moods to control your emotional state. The person they once knew may seem different because you are no longer operating from fear of rejection or the need to be chosen. The deeper transformation is not about changing them. It is about changing your relationship with yourself. You begin creating boundaries not out of anger, but out of awareness. You stop asking, "How can I make this person understand me?" and start asking, "Why am I abandoning myself to be understood?" When your inner world becomes stronger, the power struggle loses its purpose. Manipulation becomes easier to recognize because you are no longer desperate for a certain outcome. You can see situations more clearly because your emotions are no longer controlled by the desire for acceptance. The greatest shift happens when you realize that a healthy relationship does not require you to shrink yourself to make someone else comfortable. Your voice matters, your feelings matter, and your peace matters. When you stand firmly in your own identity, the entire dynamic changes because you are no longer playing the role that someone else created for you. You have returned to yourself. The deepest freedom comes when you understand that the ultimate victory is not making a narcissistic person regret losing you. It is not watching them struggle, chase, or finally recognize your value. The true transformation happens when their reaction no longer determines your emotional state. When you reach that place, you have reclaimed the most important part of yourself, your inner peace. For a long time, you may have believed that closure would come from receiving an apology, an explanation, or some acknowledgement of the pain you experienced. You may have hoped that one day they would finally understand what they did and see the value they overlooked. But the deeper psychological awakening is realizing that your healing cannot depend on another person's awareness. Some people may never fully understand the impact of their actions. Waiting for that realization can keep you emotionally connected to the very person you are trying to move beyond. Freedom begins when you stop placing the key to your peace in someone else's hands. Reclaiming yourself means returning to the parts of your identity that became lost while trying to maintain a difficult connection. It means rediscovering your confidence, your intuition, your boundaries, and your ability to trust your own experiences. You no longer measure your worth by how someone treats you because you understand that another person's inability to appreciate you does not reduce your value. A narcissistic person may notice your transformation because you no longer respond from the same place. The arguments lose their power. The attempts to provoke you become ineffective. The need to prove yourself disappears. But the most important change is happening inside you. You become someone who can remember the past without being controlled by it. You can acknowledge the pain without allowing it to define your future. You can care about someone while still choosing yourself. The greatest form of freedom is reaching a point where you no longer need someone else to realize your worth because you have already discovered it within yourself. When your peace becomes your own creation, no person, no manipulation, and no past experience can take that power away from you. The journey of recognizing a narcissistic pattern is ultimately a journey back to yourself. The most powerful moment is not when the other person finally changes, apologizes, or understands what they lost. The most powerful moment is when you no longer need those things to feel whole. You stop searching outside yourself for the validation, acceptance, and peace that was always meant to come from within. When a narcissistic person realizes you no longer care in the way you once did, they may notice the silence, the distance, and the absence of your old reactions. But the deeper story is not about their discomfort. It is about your transformation. You have reached a place where your emotions are no longer controlled by someone else's approval, criticism, or attention. The person who once felt trapped in endless questions begins to find clarity. The person who once chased answers begins to trust their own understanding. The person who once felt powerless begins to recognize their own strength. This is the hidden lesson of emotional freedom. You do not become powerful by defeating someone else. You become powerful by no longer needing to fight for your own worth. You stop trying to convince someone to see your value because you finally see it yourself. Your silence is not weakness. Your distance is not cruelty. Your peace is not indifference. They are signs that you have healed enough to stop giving away your energy to situations that continue to drain you. The greatest victory is not watching someone realize they lost access to you. The greatest victory is realizing that you have found access to yourself again. And once you return to your own center, no person's manipulation, rejection, or inability to appreciate you can take away the strength you have built within.